All right, we're shifting gears tonight. We just finished Job in our study last week, and we are starting into Psalms. There are 150 Psalms, so in this trimester we can't cover all of that. We're going to cover the first book of Psalms, which is the first 42 Psalms. And you'll understand, if you don't already, what I mean by the first book in just a moment. And so for the rest of the Psalms, we are breaking that up. We normally have covered this in 2 trimesters. We're breaking it up because we cover so much. We're going to, in the next trimester, cover 43 to 106 and go from 107 to 150 as we wind this series of Bible studies up. We're going to finish it in the Sunday morning classes together at the same time. More about that a little bit later. We're ready for Psalm 1 to 6. Irvin Jensen said, "The Psalms were not written in heaven for angels. They were written by men, for men, and have their original setting in the warp and the woof of human experience." I like that. That is in a context of him talking about inspiration, so he's not denying that they're inspired by God. In fact, he's making that point, that man was a human author. But I'm interested in this phrase here, that the setting of the warp and the woof of human experience. We'll say more about that at the end of our introduction here in just a moment, of the value of that to us in the study of Psalms. As always, we do some introductory things to introduce a book, to make it more understandable and practical and useful. So let's go to our questions for tonight. Question number 1, what is a psalm? All right. The book of Psalms is a book of praise. Song or a poem. Anything else? A psalm is simply a song. The Septuagint translation, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament Hebrew, gave the book the name psalmai, and it's from a root word which means to pluck or to twang. As we have studied the instrumental music question and the controversy over that, the argument has been made the term psalms, and singing psalms, hymns, and spiritual song means to pluck or to twang, and that's correct. And so when somebody makes that argument to you, don't get excited that they have proven you something. It just simply means to pluck or to twang. But what's to be plucked or twanged in Ephesians 5 is the heartstrings. But nonetheless, it's from this root word which means to pluck, and thus it was to be sung with harps or musical instruments. Not all of the psalms were sung with an instrument, but this refers to the whole of these psalms were to be sung generally with an instrument. The Hebrews called the book Tehillim. And so this was this book of Psalms, as we call it. It's called Tehillim, and it meant songs of praise. It was the Jewish songbook. And so these were songs of praise. We generally read these psalms, and sometimes we have set them to music and we sing these psalms, but generally we read and study and quote from the psalms. But these were a songbook for the Hebrews. The individual songs were called Mizmorim or Mizmor, and so this was Mizmor. The first one is a Mizmor. Psalm 1 is a Mizmor, or same thing with Psalm 2 and on down the line. More about that a little bit later. So Psalms has been called the songbook of the Bible. This is inspired songs, and exactly how all of that works, and that was one of the points Jensen was making in that quotation earlier in the context, exactly how all of that works, other than we know God inspired these psalms, and we'll leave it at that. But that's what a psalm is. Now, who wrote the psalms? Question 2 for tonight. Was it one author or were there several authors? Several authors. Who perhaps may be one of the earliest authors? Moses. And as late as the exile are some of the authors. David wrote 73 that we know of. Asaph wrote 12. Songs of Korah were 12. Solomon 2. Moses 1. Psalm 90. is that one that we attribute to Moses. Heman wrote Psalm 88, Ethan wrote Psalm 89, and there are 48 that were anonymous, many of which may have been written by David. There will be psalms, and we'll see some tonight, that this is a psalm of David, and the text tells us it's a psalm of David, and we know it's a psalm of David. There are going to be other psalms where David's name is not given on the psalm, but quoted from the New Testament, it's attributed to David. And so we know it was a psalm of David. There are others that we don't know. The text doesn't say. Very well could have been written by David. So we'll take each psalm as we look at it. Now, another nature of the study of psalms is that these are independent. Now, there are twin psalms that we're going to be talking about, or paired psalms, as some refer to them. Psalm 1 and 2 seem to be a pair. 3 and 4 seem to be a pair. 33 and 34 seem to be a pair, meaning that they go together, but psalms generally are independent. And what I mean by that is that the next psalm is not a continuation of the thought of the psalm before, like we have, for example, in the cycle of speeches, that as we talked about in Job, you have this speech, but that responds to this speech, and that's following from the speech before that. That's not the nature of the study of the Psalms. The Psalms are quoted in the New Testament more than any other book. We see that heavily done in the book of Hebrews. Of the 283, Halley said, that's Halley, not Haley, but Henry Halley said, of the 283 New Testament quotations, 116 are from Psalms. So it's heavily quoted in the New Testament time and again, and so it's a valuable book for our study. Let's talk about the various types of Psalms, and we could spend a whole class on this, and we're not going to spend a great deal of time. This is taken from Homer Haley's class notes, page 5. Some Psalms are acrostic, meaning they're alphabetic, where one or more sets of letters are taken in order. Psalm 9 is one of those, Psalm 10, Psalm 111, Psalm 112, Psalm 119 is the most notable of those, where it's in alphabetic order. Each line is taken. There are ethical Psalms that teach a moral or ethical lesson, like Psalm 1 tonight. There are hallelujah Psalms, as he lists them, as Haley listed, like Psalm 113, that begin and end with praise. They're historical Psalms, and so we have Psalm 105, 106 are historical Psalms that give the history of Israel. We learn a lot of history there that we know from, for example, Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, but we learn some about the history and some details that's not told elsewhere. There are imprecatory Psalms. What's an imprecatory Psalm?
Harsh statements, wishing harshness to come upon the enemies of God.
Yeah, it's invoking evil or a curse upon them. So if someone comes and says, I'm praying an imprecatory prayer for you, he's not your friend. And by the way, there have been brethren who've said that to other brethren. I'm praying imprecatory prayers for you. I'm praying that God would curse you, that God would condemn you, God do something harmful to you. So they're imprecatory Psalms. They're messianic Psalms. There's several of those, and I cite this Psalm, or he cites, this is from Haley, Psalm 22 is one of the more notable of that. Psalm 2 tonight is messianic, if you haven't already taken note of that. There's penitential Psalms. Which Psalm tonight is a penitential Psalm showing a Psalm of repentance and remorse? Psalm 6 is such a Psalm. Psalm 51 is one of the more notable. Psalm 32 is another, and we're going to list some of those here in just a moment. There are songs of ascent that were sung perhaps as the pilgrims made their yearly ascent to Jerusalem, like that are found in Psalm 120 through 134. Then there's songs of suffering, songs of thanksgiving, are some of the nature of the Psalms. That's from Haley's notes, and I think that's very helpful. Let's talk about its arrangement in the Hebrew text. There are 5 books of Psalms. They're grouped by books, thought to be by some an imitation of the Pentateuch being 5. Whether that's the case, that's conjecture on our part if we suggest that. But the division of the Psalms, Psalm 1 to 41, or 1 to 42, and Psalm 42 to 72, Psalm 73 to 89, and 90 to 106, and 107 to 150. So it's divided in books. Now we'll talk about the significance of the content of those books, but each book closes with a doxology. So we know that's the ending of the book. Now we're going to look at an outline in a moment, and our outline is based upon the books. So there are 5 divisions of the book of Psalms. Let's talk about some leading ideas. One of the most important ideas we're going to see in the Psalms is trust. I quote again from Halley, Henry Halley. He said, "This is the first and foremost idea of all the book, repeated over and over, whatever the occasion, joyous or terrifying. It drove David straight to God. Whatever his weakness, David lived in God." Putting his trust and his confidence in God. We see that over and over and over and over through the Psalms. One of the leading ideas is praise. These are songs of praise, but not every psalm is designed merely to praise. It might be a historical psalm, as we talked about. Rejoicing, loving kindness. The wicked are dealt with, the enemies, David's enemy, such as Absalom, the enemies of God, we're going to be dealt with throughout. Here's some trivia matters about Psalms I want to mention just briefly because it's not all that important. But the average psalm is about a half a page, so we're not talking about long. Psalm 119 is a very long psalm. It's the longest book or chapter of the Bible, if you want to refer to it as a chapter. Psalm 117 is the shortest, and it's the shortest psalm and the shortest chapter and the middle of the Bible. In fact, Psalm 118 in verse 8 is the middle verse of the entire Bible. I'm more interested in this outline, and I borrow that from Dehoff, and if you knew the writings of Dehoff, I'm almost positive he borrowed that from someone else. Dehoff did that quite frequently in his writings. But nonetheless, here are 5 sections, which basically are the 5 books. So Psalm 1 to 41 is the first book, and as he's outlined it, it deals with man, his blessedness, his fall, and his recovery. And we see that in our Psalms tonight, like Psalm 1. We see it in Psalm 2. We see it in Psalm 3 as well. 42 to 72 deals with Israel, her ruin, her redeemer, her redemption. The sanctuary is focused upon in Psalm 73 to 89, the earth in 90 to 106. And then Psalm 107 to 150 focuses on the Word of God, and obviously Psalm 119 sits right in the middle of all of that. Now let's mention a couple of other things. Any other thoughts that you have on the introduction to Psalms before we go further? Let's talk about the nature of Hebrew poetry briefly. In Hebrew poetry, this is the poetic section. You have Job, you have Psalms, you have Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon. Those are Hebrew poetry. And as you read that for the first time, which is not your first time obviously, but one who does read that for the first time, they recognize it doesn't have the rhyme or the meter of the Western world. And so you think this is not poetry. But the nature of Hebrew poetry, and I want to mention 3 things, and I quote here from Irvin Jensen again, that it primarily deals with thought patterns. And what we mean by that is he mentions 3 parallelisms. Quite often the Psalms have parallelisms. And there's 3 forms of that. Number 1 is the synonymous form, wherein a statement is made, then another statement is made that says essentially the same thing. Let me give you an example of that. Psalm 24, verse 1. Here is an example of synonymous. The earth is the Lord and the fullness thereof, the world and they that dwell therein. See, that says the same thing. Here's 2 lines that are synonymous or say the same thing. Another form is the antithetic, or the very opposite, where one statement is made and the opposite is dealt with. For example, in Psalm 1:6 tonight, the Lord knoweth the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. So the second line is saying just focusing in the opposite direction. Then there is the synthetic, which has reference to a line being stated, and the second line adds and more information to that or explains that. For example, Psalm 19 and verse 7, the law of the Lord is perfect. What's the next line? Converting the soul. It's complete. One of the things it does is it converts the soul. So we're going to watch for those parallelisms throughout our study of the Psalms. Now, before we go to Psalm 1, what practical value is there in studying the Psalms? As we study the Psalms, what practical value is there in the Psalms? You say, well, this was a songbook.
It's all advice. I think tonight you see advice to a man who wants to be righteous. You see advice to the leaders, kings, advice to those who can be in trouble or having going through troublesome times. And advice to the man that's in his prayer life, the man that's living righteous.
All right. Good instruction. What else? Good point. Good models of praise. If you're looking for expressions of praise or expressions of request even, how do I pray? What do I say to the Lord in times of trouble? What do I say to the Lord to praise Him? Here are numerous examples of that. What else?
You see the emotions of people in tough relationship with God.
All right.
Turbulent emotions.
Yeah, up and down. You see David, for example, Psalm 55, he was ready to fly away and be at rest, and then he comes running back to God. We'll see that. Jensen mentions two things. He said it furnishes us with models of devotion. And so we have David and we have other psalmists, but the people of God that are mentioned throughout the Psalms, here are models of devotion, and which we've already mentioned. The second thing I thought quite interesting is that the Psalm teaches us in terms of human experience and not abstractly. What's meant by that? In other words, Psalm doesn't just take a principle and a theory and say, this is what you ought to do. But it teaches us by experience through David, for example. We just mentioned Psalm 55. David suffered so much that he said, I wish I could just run away and hide somewhere. And yet he come running back to God. So it teaches us through human experience that here was a man who lived through that. Or what it's like to be forgiven of sin, or commit a grievous sin rather, and embrace forgiveness. Psalm 51. That's powerful. All right, let's talk about Psalm the First, as Charles Spurgeon would call it. Let's talk about Psalm the First. 6 verses in our Psalm. And so what is this Psalm about? So question number 3, part 1 or part A, give me a summary of Psalm 1. All right. Contrasting the righteous to the unrighteous, or the righteous versus the wicked. Simple psalm, but it's powerful. And what a way to begin this great book. So he talks about 3 things: the blessedness of the righteous, and then he talks about the fate of the wicked, and then God's approval. Now, because we're trying to get through 6 psalms, we're not going to get bogged down to too many details, but I do want to start with the first word here. Blessed is the man. The word blessed is a plural term, which has reference to a multiplicity of God's blessings to be poured upon. The richness of God's blessings to be poured upon the man who does the following. What does he do or not do? He doesn't walk in the counsel of the ungodly. Number 1. Number 2, he does not stand in the way of sinners. And thirdly, he does not sit in the seat of the scornful. Now, let's stop and talk about those 3 things. What does it mean to walk in the counsel of the ungodly? Yeah, listen to their counsel, listen to their advice, listen to their input. Remember, Moses warned the people that if you mingle with the people of the land, you'll learn their ways. You start listening to their counsel. You listen to their instruction. You listen to their advice. Blessed is the man who doesn't listen to the ungodly, nor stand in the way of sinners. What does it mean to stand in the way of sinners? It doesn't mean stand preventing them. It means standing with them. But you may not be participating with them yet, but you're standing in their way. When you stand in their way, what are you doing? You're getting familiar. You're learning their ways. So you don't listen to their advice, nor do you get familiar with them and spend time with them. And furthermore, you don't sit in the seat of the scornful. What does that mean?
Doesn't have respect, authority, or God's authority.
Yeah, you're sitting in that seat, which means you're doing the same thing they're doing. They've reached the point they are scoffing at God and God's authority, and maybe you didn't start there, but you started listening to the counsel, then standing in the way, and now you're sitting in the seat doing the very same thing. You've heard me repeatedly mention this in sermons. This is a description of progression into sin. It starts out by listening to counsel, leading to standing in the way, getting more familiar, and the next thing you know, you're sitting in the seat. You might write out in the margin of your text, Psalm 106, verses 35 and 36 describes the same kind of progression. When we get to Psalm 106, guess what we're going to do? We're going to make a note back over to Psalm 1, where we are. They describe progression into sin. And so you say, well, how in the world did this person that used to be faithful ever reach this point? They're right in the middle doing the same thing they used to condemn. They started listening to the advice, then got familiar by standing in the way. Now they're sitting in the seat of the scornful. All right, enough about that. But in contrast, what does he do? He doesn't just follow the law of the Lord, but he delights in the law of the Lord. And in his law, he meditates day and night. This word meditate means to growl, to mutter. And footnote, if you have the New King James, somebody read their New King James footnote.
Ponders by talking to himself.
Talking to himself. That word, we talked about that word in our hermeneutics class. We talked about how looking up a word can help us. It literally means talking to yourself. He's muttering. Kind of like when somebody's working and just talking to, and you say, he's talking to himself. He's not talking where you can hear, but he's talking to himself. He meditates in the sense he talks to himself about what the word of, here's what it said, here's what I need to do, here's what that means. You basically, doesn't mean you literally have to talk to yourself, but it is as if you're talking to yourself and you're muttering to yourself and grumbling to yourself or growling, as the word may mean, to yourself. Here's what the text says. Here's what it means. So he delights in it and he meditates on it. How often does he meditate upon it? Day and night. Now then, there's a contrast between that delighting in the law and those three negative things that we just mentioned a moment ago. But now verse 3 says he's like a tree planted by the rivers of water. What does that suggest?
Fruitful.
Very fruitful. Not planted by the river of water, but planted by the rivers of water. The idea is as if it's between two rivers. So if you planted a tree right by a river, do you think it's going to grow? Got plenty of water. What if it's right between two rivers? It's going to be fed from all sides. So he's planted by the rivers of water. In other words, he's going to be productive, he's going to grow, he's going to produce and be acceptable and pleasing to God. But, verse 4 now, let's turn to the godly. The Septuagint words it this way, not so ungodly, not so. In other words, whatever was true of the righteous is not true. In other words, he's not going to be fruitful, he's not planted by the rivers of water, he doesn't delight in the law of the Lord. He doesn't meditate in it day and night. He does stand in the way of sinners. He does sit in the seat of the scornful. Not so ungodly, not so. He's like the chaff which the wind drives away. Jesus talks about this in Matthew 3, about the winnowing fan and the separating of the wheat from the chaff. They would take the winnowing fork and cast the seed up, and what would happen to the chaff? Blown away, blown to the side. And that's what happens to the ungodly. They're blown away like the chaff. Now then, let's finish with verse 6. The Lord knows the way of the righteous, but the way of the ungodly shall perish. What does that tell you? What does it mean the Lord knows the way of the righteous? The Lord knows the way of the wicked too, doesn't he? I think it has to do with God's approval. God knows the way of the righteous. He takes note of that and he approves of the way of the righteous. But the way of the ungodly, they're going to perish. So it's a contrast between righteousness and wickedness. Make sense? Ethical psalm. Righteousness versus wickedness. All right, let's go to the psalm, the second. This is, I've given it the title, Jehovah's Anointed. And it is a messianic psalm. It deals with the Messiah. So we haven't got far, and we've already hit a messianic psalm. So I call this simply Jehovah's Anointed. This is taken, I think, some of these outlines, I can't remember all my sources. I believe this is taken from Kenneth Green's outline of Psalm 2. deals with man's rebellion, God's reply, divine plan, or admonition, or the world's voice, the Father's voice, Son's voice, and the Spirit's voice. And you say, well, where did you get that idea? Well, let's start working through the psalm. Let's go to question 2, question 3b. Give me a summary of Psalm 2. What else?
No plans against God to rebel against Him will be successful.
Absolutely. The plans to rebel and to overthrow God's plan to reject His Christ is not going to work. Unsuccessful. And that's what this psalm is about. So let's talk about man's rebellion, verses 1 to 3. We won't spend as much time on the other psalms. I'm just partial to Psalm 1 and some of the lessons there, why I spent more time there. Why do the nations or the heathens rage and the people plot vain things? Some suggest, and I'll leave you to decide, whether that the nations refer to the Gentiles and the people refer to the Jews. I'll leave that for you to decide. Both Jew and Gentile rebelled against God. Kings set themselves against Him. Rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against His anointed. That refers to Christ. This is quoted, by the way, this is quoted in the New Testament in Acts 4, applied to Christ. It's quoted in Acts 13. It's quoted in Hebrews 1. He quoted in Hebrews 5, quoted in Revelation 2, Revelation 12, and Revelation 19. I said quoted. Sometimes there's just a reference, an allusion to, and not necessarily a direct quote, particularly in Revelation. For example, verse 7 and 8. Particularly are quoted. So, verse 3, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords. What's the point? The nations rage against God, and what are they saying about God? We want to do away with God, cast Him off, cast off His bounds, cast off His authority, and they rage against God. So that's the world's voice. But God's got a different idea. So what's God's voice say? God replies, verses 4 to 6. What does God say? Or what is said about God? He that sits in the heavens is going to do what? He laughs at that. You're not going to overthrow me. And He holds them in derision. He speaks to them in His wrath and distress in His deep displeasure. Yet I have set my king on my holy hill in Zion. And so what's He saying? Yeah, absolutely. He's going to set up a king above all other kings, and God's going to carry out His plan anyway, even though man had rebelled against God, even though man tried to overthrow God, even though man tries to overturn the plan of God, God's going to set up His plan anyway. So that was God's reply. Now then, here's the Son's voice. And I know it's the Son's voice because it's as if the Son is speaking at verse 9. I will declare the decree, the Lord has said to me, you are my Son. Today have I begotten you. That refers to the resurrection. How do I know? Yeah, it's quoted in the New Testament and applied to the resurrection. We see that particularly in Acts chapter 13 and Acts chapter 4 as well. So the Father had said to me, you are my Son, today have I begotten you. Ask of me and I will give you the nations for an inheritance, the ends of the earth for your possession. And He shall break them with a rod of iron. What does that suggest to you? He is going to be given, the Son will be given absolute authority. If He breaks them with a rod of iron, and He shall dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. One writer said, what doesn't bend is going to break. I like that. In other words, what doesn't bend to the authority and the power of Christ is going to be broken by the power and the authority of Christ. So what doesn't bend is going to break. Now then, the Spirit's voice. Now why do I say that's the Spirit's voice? Because we've seemed to have shifted gears a little bit, and it's not the Son speaking, but it's admonition given about those who should serve the Son. Therefore, be wise, O King. We're starting at verse 10. Be wise, O kings. Be instructed, you judges of the earth. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Kiss the Son. What does it mean to kiss the Son? Reverence Him. Honor Him. Worship Him. Kiss the Son. It's an act of homage. Your footnote will say an act of homage and submission. So it's lest He be angry and you perish, and His wrath is kindled but a little, in a little while, in other words, in a short order. Blessed are those who put their trust in Him. So the admonition was, then you better listen to the Son. So what's the point of the psalm? The psalm is saying the world rebelled against God and tried to reject God's authority. God said, I'm going to establish what I plan anyway. The Son said He made me, called me His Son, and today has He begotten me. That is a prophecy of the resurrection. And so the Spirit says you better listen to Him now. Make sense? And so it's Jehovah's anointed that has been rejected, and yet you better pay attention because His wrath is going to be kindled. Make sense?
Donnie, I agree that this is messianic for sure. I mean, it's pretty obvious to us. I don't know, like a lot of times these are written for the context of that time period, and then there's another layer that is for a later time period once we understand the scheme of redemption. I kind of look at this as, you know, I don't know if this is David or whatever king it might be, but they actually ruled other nations during that time. And so it's almost like and they always had to put down, you know, Moab or whoever they were in charge of. So it's almost like, you know, they're seeking a rebellion, and God is saying, no, I installed this king. You're not going to be able to overthrow what I've done here. So I kind of wonder if that's the circumstances of the time period, but like a lot of things that talk about David and whatever else, it's a messianic as well.
Perhaps. What I can say is the interpretation that's given in Acts 4, Acts 13, Hebrews 1, tells me it has to refer to Christ. And it does. And so I'm going to leave it at that. Any other questions or comments? All right, that's Psalm 2. Let's go to Psalm the 3rd. And so let's go to question number 3. And point C, give me a summary of Psalm 3.
Even with David being surrounded in time of trouble, he's comforted. He knows where to go to get his comfort.
All right, yeah, David has trouble. This is the first psalm that has a title to it. By title, I'm not talking about, as I call this, Trust a Morning Prayer. The title, A Psalm of David when he fled from Absalom his son, is part of the text. That's not supplied by translators. So that title is given by God, a Psalm of David. So I know this is a Psalm of David, and it's when he fled from Absalom. And so he has an enemy that is pursuing him. Now, this is referred to as a morning prayer. And by the way, Psalm 1 and 2 seem to be, some suggest those are pair or twin psalms, or a pair of psalms that go hand in hand. That here's the contrast of the righteous versus the wicked. Then here is the wicked who rebelled, and yet those who need to listen are those who are righteous. Well, Psalm 3 and 4, there's a morning prayer and there's an evening prayer in Psalm 4. And we'll talk about here in just a second. So this is a Psalm of David. 4 things happen here. There's the lament concerning his present distress. Let's see what verses 1 and 2. How they have increased to trouble me, and many who rise up against me. Many who are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. What's that saying? Yeah. So Absalom has a following. Absalom has the majority with him. And consequently, some are saying that David doesn't have God on his side. And then we have this word we're introduced to, we're going to see several times. We see this word Selah. And we'll see it again at verse 4. We see, what does that word mean? All right, it's a pause. Some think that it has reference to a direction for an instrumental interlude. Some scholars argue that they think that it had reference to an instrumental interlude. I don't have a problem with that because instruments were used with the Psalms. Very well could be. Some think it had reference to just merely a pause for contemplation. And so that you sing the psalm and then you pause, and let's think about that. And one writer suggested that what use can we make of that word? Well, we're not singing it with instruments, or we're going to read it with instruments, but it might be a good practice that when we reach that word, just stop and pause and reflect on what we just read. Now, that might be effective in a song if we sang a verse and then just pause and let's think about what we just sang. Now let's sing another verse and let's pause and think about that. And that may be what this was about. But be that as it may, let's go to verse 3 and 4. David's relationship sustains him, is the point being made here. But you are a shield for me. What else do you see in verses 3 and 4? Yeah, he cried out unto God and God heard him. So my hope and my relationship to God sustains me in this distress when Absalom is fleeing. And let's look at verses 5 and 6. He asked for protection during the night. I lay down and sleep. This is why we call this the morning prayer. I lay down and slept. I woke for you, for the Lord sustained me. I laid down and I woke up, and the Lord sustained me through the night. I was not afraid of 10,000 people who have set themselves against me all around. I went to bed and I woke up, and so this is my morning prayer for the protection and care through the night, and there is this pledge for help. Now, beginning at verse 7, what do you see in 7 and 8? When he arises in the morning, here's this renewed call with seemingly stronger determination of calling upon God. Arise, O Lord, save me, O my God, for you struck all my enemies on the cheekbone and you've broken the teeth of the ungodly. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Your blessing is upon your people. So what's the point of the psalm? David is saying that what was going on here, there is a problem where the multitude is going after Absalom, and they're saying of me that God's not with me. But I know you are with me. That my relationship to you, I have my confidence in you. So I went to bed at night and I woke up the next morning. You sustained me through the night, and I know you're going to help. And so here's this renewed strength he has in the morning. Does that make sense? Here's a morning prayer of his trust and his confidence in God. Now, we started on the note a moment ago that trust is one of the main things, Halley said, throughout the entire book of Psalms, that is all the books of Psalms and all the Psalms, is trust. And we see that here in Psalm 3. Questions or comments? We saw that with Job. Job could be upset and then he turns to God. But I still have confidence in God. And that very well may be the point.
This kind of reminds me, Shane, from Chuck over this, musically. But, we've seen that song, Low in the Grave, and then he arose, and there's a crescendo or whatever. It's almost like we start off kind of like, oh, it's looking really bad, and then, there's a pause, and then there's like, but you were going to be back.
Yeah.
Save me.
Very well, could be. Very well could be. Let's look at the other psalm that goes with this other part of the pair of psalms, Psalm 4. What do you see in Psalm 4? Question number 3, part D. Psalm 4, give me a summary.
Before we get that, can I say something about verse 8? That he asked for blessings upon his people, even though those people had turned against him. He doesn't just pray for himself. So like, salvation of the Lord, your blessing be upon your people. He prays for others. He prays for his people, even though they have not been loyal to him.
Good point. Good point. All right, Psalm 4. What do we have in Psalm 4? This also is a psalm of trust, and this is seemingly focusing on an evening prayer. This is a psalm of David, the text tells us. So let's see what we've got here. In verses 1 to 4, Jehovah is a God of righteousness. He cries out to Jehovah. We're going to hit the high points so we can try to get some of Psalm 5 and 6, particularly 6. It said, hear when I call, O God, my righteousness. You have relieved me when I was in distress. Have mercy on me, hear my prayers. And then he turns, and as several writers make this observation, that it seems as if he stops praying and starts preaching. Have you ever heard someone that you thought was doing that in their prayer? And it's like we quit praying and almost start talking, and what we need to do is, and it's almost like we're urging other people, we need to respond. And it seems like he does that. At verse 2, he says, how long, O you sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love a worthlessness and seek falsehood? Here's that word, Selah. I know the Lord has set apart for himself who is godly. The Lord will hear when I call on him. And so he turns and he addresses man. And then there's the continuation in verses 3 and 4 of his address to God. And like at verse 4, be angry and do not sin. Meditate within your heart on your bed and be still. And so he addresses man, he addresses God. God is a righteous God. But then in verses 5 and 6, what do we see? There's a call for a change. Yes. Offer the sacrifices of right and put your trust in the Lord. There are many who say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up your light of your countenance on us. You have put gladness in my heart. Verses 7 and 8 is the idea of that the Jehovah and the psalmist have consolation and joy, that I will both lie down in peace. Here is the idea of this being an evening prayer, that I will lie down in peace and sleep, and you alone, Lord, will make me dwell in safety. Basically the same kind of point we saw in Psalm 3, but this seems to be an evening prayer. God is a God of righteousness. There's the call for repentance and sacrifice, but there's joy and consolation. God's going to be with me through the night. Make sense? This is an evening prayer. We take that from verse 8. Now let's go to Psalm 5, and I want to quickly hit Psalm 5 because I want to get to Psalm 6 to introduce a thought that we're going to deal with several times throughout the Psalms. Psalm 5 is a prayer for protection from the enemy. This seems to be a morning prayer before going to the house of God. It seems to be the case. So I want to quickly notice this so we can get to Psalm 6. In Psalm 5, he talks about, as one writer, this is not original with me, the inner side of the devout life, having access to God, and then the outward side is the way. In other words, the psalmist's desire in verses 1 to 3 is to be heard. Look at verse give ear to me, O Lord, consider my meditation. Verse 3, in the morning I will direct to you and I will look up. So I want you to listen to me. This is a right, verses 4 to 6. We often talk about other passages making this point, but verses 4 to 6 tell us the ungodly don't have this right coming before God, that you are not a God who takes pleasure in wickedness, nor shall the evil dwell with you. The boastful shall not stand in your sight. In other words, they're not going to listen. But as for me, verse 7, I will come to your house. This is why we say this is probably before going to the house of God. As for me, I'm going to come to your house in the multitude of your mercy. In the fear will I worship you toward your holy temple. So this seems to be a prayer he's offering before he goes to the house of God. Then he talks about prayer will be a guidance in life. Verse 8, lead me in your righteousness because of your enemies. Then verses 9 and 10, here's a prayer for the destruction of the wicked. And then in verses 11 and 12, the prayer for the righteous and the anticipated blessing. So what's this psalm about? It seems to be before going to worship, the song of God blessing us and God protecting us. And may God, I'm thankful that I have the privilege of praying, and the ungodly don't have that same privilege. Now I hurried through that so we could get to Psalm 6. Psalm 6 is a penitential psalm dealing with penitence. And we have several of those, 7 psalms that we're going to look at. There's Psalm 6. Psalm 32 talks about David when he sinned with Bathsheba. So does Psalm 51. Psalm 38, Psalm 102, 130, and 143. All of those are those type of psalms. So let's get this one quickly, and our time is gone. Psalm 6. What do you see in Psalm 6? This is a psalm of David.
Almost like he's facing sickness and weakness and crying out to God for mercy and help.
Yeah, do not rebuke me in your anger or chasten me. There's something that would cause anger of God. So this seems to be penitence about sin. Have mercy on me, I'm weak. My bones are troubled. My soul is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? How long for deliverance? In other words, he's crying out for deliverance, seems to be the point. So here's the cry of this troubled soul, as one writer put it. Verses 4 to 7, an appeal for deliverance by Jehovah's mercy. Save me for your mercy's sake. For in death there is no remembrance of me. In the grave, who will give thanks? I'm weary of my groaning. And so my eyes waste away. Notice he said, I drench my couch with tears all night, or every night. The footnote says, I make my bed swim. I've shed tears and tears and tears. And so here's this sadness. And then verses 8 through 10 to finish that up, what does he say? The workers of iniquity, y'all just leave me alone, because the Lord has heard me. The Lord has heard me. And the Lord's heard my supplication and received my prayer. And one of the things I'm learning from this, that a very practical thing, and all through the penitential Psalms, David particularly in Psalm 32, Psalm 51, Psalm 6, David embraces forgiveness. Why is that important to mention that? Finish my sentence. Quite often when a person commits a grievous sin, they have a hard time forgiving themselves and embracing that I have been forgiven. David embraces forgiveness. He does that in Psalm 6. We see it especially in Psalm 51, that he committed a grievous sin, but he embraces, God's forgiven me. I'm accepting the forgiveness. I know God's forgiven me. And that's an important lesson for us to learn. We'll pick up with 7 next time, go through 12. Psalm 7 to 12.